Chapter 7. The detachment, having returned to Cape Girardeau, remained until July, when the surrender of Vicksburg, Battle of Helena, and the capture of Port Hudson, opening the Mississippi, suggested a campaign for the possession of Arkansas. On this third march to Bloomfield, some members of the detachment, acting without orders, remembering some of the outrages upon loyal citizens and captured soldiers at certain points on the road, burned some houses that had been a shelter for the offenders. This indiscretion gave great offense to General Davidson, who was in command. It does not appear reasonable that a man entrusted with the command of patriotic volunteers in such a war should vent his personal spleen upon an entire body of men because of the supposed faults of a few individuals. It is a fact, however, that men of a certain caliber, when in command of troops, regard every infraction of their orders, however foolish the order and unintentional the offense, as a direct insult to themselves and to their shoulder straps. They cannot persuade themselves to simply regard an act as an offense against the rules for the government of armies, and a proper subject for discipline under those rules. Such men resort to personal punishments, and in the case of individuals would order that the offender carry a rail in front of the tent of the brutal officer giving the order. Whether or not by this means the detachment incurred the hatred of the doughty officer in command, and became the victim of an unreasoning vengeance, may never be known. But it would be hard to persuade many of the men who suffered, and whose comrades died under the hardships of a long campaign in which a small body of infantry was compelled to follow a cavalry expedition, that the act was not one of brutality rather than idiocy. Of this campaign, Sergeant Boyd says, "At Bloomfield, General Davidson issued an order that we should be attached to the 3rd Brigade of his cavalry division. An extra pair of shoes were issued to each man, with an order that he must carry them in his knapsack. The men must also carry their tents, 40 rounds of cartridges, 3 days' rations, and march to keep up with the cavalry." We left Bloomfield by the West Prairie and Chalk Bluff Road, and although the day was hot, kept pace with the Reserve Brigade of Cavalry, Colonel Caldwell commanding. By 2 p.m. next day, had made 40 miles, crossing the St. Francis River at Chalk Bluff, and continued the meandering march down that stream among the miasmatic marshes under the heat of a scorching sun, where good water was unknown. Reaching Wicksburg, the command halted to have the sick sent to Helena and to procure supplies. Here scouts reported that Price and Marmaduke were between us and Jacksonport, preparing to give us battle. Preparations were made to receive them, fortifying the approaches to Wicksburg and the junction of the Jacksonport and Helena roads, and keeping out a strong picket force and the reserves well in hand. No enemy appearing in force, the command started again and moved towards Helena, but when some 25 miles west of that place it halted and made a hank movement to the west, reaching Clarendon on White River on the 24th. The weather was exceedingly hot, and especially so when coming in contact with the trains and cavalry as they would pass and repass. Men marched in dense clouds of dust, and many, overcome with the heat and dust, gave out and fell by the wayside, and were unable to reach camp until far in the night. At Clarendon, more sick men were left. Camp dysentery and malarial fevers now commenced to tell fearfully among the men. August 10th, Major Eberhart received orders to hold battalion in readiness, with 5 days' rations, to go on gunboats up the river to capture boats of the enemy. On the 12th, Captain Detar, with A and D, boarded the gunboat Cricket, while F and G went upon the Marmora, with Major Eberhart. At Des Arc, the major went aboard the Lexington with Captain Bash, who commanded the flotilla. They proceeded carefully up the Little Red River, a tributary of the White River, a narrow, deep stream, and the bank full from recent rains. The 3 boats carried each 6 guns. Two on the Lexington were long-range Parrott guns, and the other were 24-pound howitzers. At Des Arc, a corporal's guard was sent ashore with a squad of men as pickets, and to see where the Johnnies went. Going to a house not far away, they found a man who knew nothing, as a matter of course, but he was taken in all the same and put in charge of one of our scouts. An old black man said 2 small boats went up the river carrying supplies to Marmaduke's men. The white folks said, no, hadn't seen any boats for months. But the black man says, they're up the river in the bend. The blacks didn't often lie to Union soldiers. Continuing up the river and turning a sharp bend near Searcy Landing, hovering in sight of a pontoon bridge over which a portion of Marmaduke's troops had just crossed, leaving their pickets at the bridge, when lo, there lay 2 small transports, the Tom Suggs and the Kaskaskia, and our captured man, who knew nothing, was the pilot who ran them there. One shot from our bow gun caused them to surrender, and our own men boarded them, throwing out skirmishers, driving away their pickets, capturing their dinner of cornbread and roasting ears, and throwing a few shells as a salute into Shelby's camp just to let the dashing Joe know that we were in friendly nearness to him. In fact, we were almost to the camp of Shelby's brigade. Burned the pontoon, and then turned down the stream. Lieutenant Templin, in command of the Kaskaskia, in the lead. Before returning, cotton bales were taken on board, and a line of bulletproof breastworks built around the boats composing the little fleet. Shelby, taken by surprise at the bold, defiant bearing of the little squad, shelling the woods on either side, and throwing shot and shell so interestingly near his own camp, ordered Thompson's brigade of infantry, a company of light artillery, and a company of sharpshooters to pursue and capture them by cutting across one of the great bends of the very winding little stream. When near West Point, under the cover of heavy timber and thick underbrush, they opened a murderous fire, the aim appearing to kill the pilots and thereby cripple the movements of the little fleet. But the Cricket came up and gave them a volley of grape and canister. Colonel Gilkey, commanding their advance regiment, and splendidly mounted, fell mortally wounded within 10 feet of the Cricket, and died within a few hours. Major Sankey of the same regiment was also wounded. At times, the Kaskaskia, the stream being very narrow, the limbs on both sides would brush the boats and swing them against the bank, and the enemy was only prevented from boarding her at the point of the bayonet. Had it not been for the protection of the cotton bales as breastworks, hardly a man would have escaped. The utmost coolness and bravery was throughout exhibited by both officers and men. George H. Pox of Company D was mortally wounded and died that night, and 6 others were also wounded. The enemy's loss must have been very severe. One of their own reports admits that they paid dearly for their temerity. On the 30th, we went down the White River about 10 miles below Clarendon and landed under the cover of the gunboats at about 9 o'clock at night and drove the enemy before us before they made a hasty retreat. On the first day of August, the march was again resumed in the direction of Little Rock. On the second day of August, that place, bearing the euphonious name of Dead Man's Lake, was reached. It was sort of a lake or pond in an old river bed, filled with filthy water, covered with a thick coating of green scum, and innumerable insects, large and small, floating on the surface, with plenty of dead fish in it. The day was hot, the country through which we marched destitute of water, and men marched through clouds of dust, especially when coming in contact with trains, and in passing and repassing the cavalry. The men's eyes, mouths, and nostrils were full of dust, and when we reached even the water of Dead Man's Lake, it was preempted by the cavalry, but a guard was placed over a portion of it. After it had been mixed by the horses' feet, men crazed by thirst drank what horses would not taste. The time spent in that part of Arkansas was one of suffering from heat and thirst, and the 4 companies of the 32nd Iowa not only marched to keep up with the cavalry, but did picket guard duty every night.